Academy. So today is actually very timely. I will be going through a seminar on preparing for college applications. So this will not only go through two of the more common application systems that many students will probably be using, both the common application and the UC application, but it'll also give you a little bit more context in terms of, the competitive landscape of these colleges, and also some practical tips and advice that you can do in order to strengthen your applications. Now, of course, this is going to be very helpful for students who are already rising seniors who can definitely benefit from this as they work on their applications. But the advice here can also help even younger students so that they actually know what steps lie ahead. And that actually gives you more time to prepare the elements that should go into the actual application itself. Okay, so let's get started. I do ask that if you have any questions for me, you can already type it ahead of time, but please do so in the Q&A box and not in the chat box, right? So normally chat would be like, I don't know, if for any reason I freeze or you don't hear any audio, I think that would help for that one. But if it's a question that you do want me to answer at the end of the seminar for the Q&A session, feel free. That way you don't forget if it's in response to or asking me about anything that you see in the seminar. It's probably better that you ask me while you still remember it. Okay, so I'll gladly answer as many questions as I can with the time allotted. Okay, so let's get right to it. So first of all, please refrain from recording all of this. We'll probably make a recording of this available anyway, right? So it'll just kind of like, impede your ability to process all this information now anyway. Okay, so first, let's talk about the competitive landscape of college admissions right now. So in general, you've heard me maybe talk about this before if you've attended any of my seminars in the past, but one of the key things that has made the current admissions landscape even more competitive than it already is the fact that a lot of schools, because of COVID, have shifted to what are called test optional policies, right? And so what happens with test optional is then you don't have to submit the score. And while that's certainly a benefit for certain students, it actually makes it so that the entire process itself becomes even more competitive because students who otherwise would not have applied to certain colleges are now incentivized to apply because the previous roadblock, which is having a good SAT or ACT score, is no longer something that prevents them from applying. Now, of course, if you're on the side where you have great grades but not good test scores, that's a bonus for you. That definitely helps you have a shot at some of these schools you wouldn't otherwise have. But what it also does, and what has been doing for the last 2 or 3 years or so, is that it has made things much more competitive because now more people are trying for those top schools. Okay. Now, one positive note, though, is based on last year, we have seen some schools where the rate of the decline of these acceptance rate has slowed a little bit. And in some cases, it's kind of plateaued. It's remained the same as the previous years. But in some cases, it actually went up slightly, right? So that's certainly maybe a good sign. It's also maybe a good sign that some universities are now bringing back the SAT or ACT requirements because that'll also maybe dissuade from some students from applying to these top colleges, which means, of course, the acceptance rate will be higher as a result, hopefully. Okay. All right, so if we examine the most recent acceptance rates for the Ivy League schools, you can see what I'm talking about, right? So the previous year, there was a massive drop. This is from the red to the yellow here, right? Or orange, whatever you want to call that. So we could see like dropping by 2, sometimes even 3 percentage points. But this past year, many schools, it's just a minor difference. Like Harvard only went down by about like 0.2%. In some cases, Princeton and a couple other schools have even stayed the same. There are going to be some outliers there, like you see UPenn actually decreasing by another 2%, but for the most part, the decline has sort of slowed a little bit, which is maybe a little bit of a good news because then we're not going to see things plummet to like from 4 to 2% all of a sudden. Okay. So that might be encouraging news for those of you who are aspiring to top universities like the Ivy League schools, because it then means that maybe you have a little bit more of a fighting chance to get into these schools next year or this year. Okay. Now, this trend somewhat continues as well with very competitive private schools beyond the Ivies. As you can see here, MIT is always going to be low, right? It's 4%. It has been for the last couple of years or so. But there are going to be certain schools where like NYU and USC have remained kind of similar, whereas some other schools have even increased slightly, right? So hopefully if this trend holds, it's largely because one, like I said, with new requirements like having some schools have the SAT requirement again, that makes things a little bit harder for certain students. So you're not going to have this mad rush of people trying to apply to these top schools. But two, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that the incoming class sizes for some of these schools are in some cases becoming bigger. They're simply slightly accepting more students because they know that it's maybe scaring some students from applying because of the sheer numbers of people applying. So they want to try to even that out a bit to give more people the chance to go to their school. Okay. All right. So in general, I think it's helpful for you to understand the general timeline for college applications. So I want to go through some of the key dates that you're going to want to remember. Right. So first, this one already passed, but August 1st, right, a couple of weeks ago, is when the Common App went live. What that means is that normally midsummer, they basically sort of shut down the Common Application for maintenance while they update all the information there and the essay prompts and that stuff. So, Common App goes live August 1st every single year, which means you can theoretically send in your applications that early. We normally don't recommend sending things in August 1st because, well, that doesn't give you ample time to really prepare your essays and the application, right? It does make sense to send it early though, as in we normally recommend maybe, anywhere from 2 weeks to a month before any deadlines, because we feel like that strategically helps you get a better read from admissions officers. They're less rushed. In some cases, that actually helps you be first in line for things like, setting up college interviews, because that, is more like a first come first serve basis, right? They don't really pick out interviews just for people they like better. They just do it based on when they receive your application. So that's one of those things that people don't really talk about that much, but if you submit your applications earlier, it enhances your application in those two ways. Okay. Now, August 1st, that's already there, which means if you're a senior, rising senior, you can already create your Common App account with the current topics. Now, not every single college has released their prompts yet. I think that will maybe take another week or two for some schools. So just be patient if maybe your ED school or your dream school hasn't released their essay prompts yet. Okay. Now, normally for most colleges, November 1st is the deadline for most early action or early decision schools. Now, there are going to be some outliers. There's some schools that have their deadlines as early as, let's say, October 15th. I think there's certain schools, for instance, like Stanford, if you're going to submit a music portfolio or something, any sort of portfolio, they have you submit it 2 weeks earlier. So October 15th will be the actual deadline for certain schools like Stanford. Okay. So the winner of the earliest quote unquote regular decision deadline is University of Washington. Every single year, they like to have their deadline November 15th. And this is not early action or early decision. That is just University of Washington's normal application deadline, right? So it sort of has that distinction or notoriety, if you will, right, of being the earliest RD deadline. Okay, so if University of Washington is on your list, maybe because you really like their computer science program, really start the process early. Okay, one bit of good news, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, is that University of Washington is now a Common App school. So that maybe if you've already done an early action or early decision school, that makes the work a little bit easier because you've already filled out the application for it, right? So that's probably going to help a little bit. Okay, now December 1st is normally a notable scholarship deadline for certain schools, right? So USC is one of the most well known of this, so that if you submit your application by December 1st, you're automatically considered for any one of their many merit scholarships, right? If you submit past that deadline, they will simply not consider you for merit aid. And there are going to be some schools like this too, where, even if the normal deadline is January 1st, January 3rd, they will have some special deadlines for scholarship consideration where you might want to look ahead of time just to make sure you don't miss the window on some of these. For many schools, December 1st, December 15th would be the scholarship deadline. Okay, so it's well worth your time to check. Once you already know your list of colleges, definitely do your homework and check on the deadlines for all these schools, right? So mid-December is usually when the early decision results are released, right? So the good thing about that, of course, is that if you get accepted to your ED school, you can then choose not to apply to any of the remaining schools. You probably do have to withdraw from them anyway. I think that's part of your ED agreement, right? And then, yes, you're set. You don't have to worry about college apps for the rest of, the year, right? Some schools will then release their early action decisions this time too. But a trend that I'm seeing is that many schools that used to announce sometime in December are now waiting until like January or February. Okay. I think one of the rationales for that is that many of these schools know that students have been using their EA as maybe like an early backup or an early safety. And announcing later may disincentivize some students from just sending in a frivolous application, even if they're not really serious about the school. That's at least my theory about it. Okay. So for most RD decisions or RD deadlines, sorry, it's anywhere from January 1st to about January 7th or 8th, right? So you'd want to check on the specific schools that you're applying to. But in general, just as a rule of thumb, I always tell students, finish your applications no later than maybe like December 15th, December 17th. That way you can just enjoy the holidays. You don't have to stress out about working on college essays while you're enjoying like Christmas or New Year's or whatever. Okay. Now, you then have to wait for another maybe couple of months for you to hear from these schools. Now, normally it's going to be maybe like mid-March to about sometime in April, right? Normally by about mid-April, you should already have heard from all your schools. I think it's very rare that you have schools announcing by like late April, because in many cases, May 1st is the deadline for you to basically sort of state your intent to register. In other words, to accept their offer, right? So this is the general timeline each year. Now, of course, there's going to be maybe some outliers or some exceptions to this rule, but this pretty much holds for the vast majority of schools out there, okay? All right, so let's take a look. So the first thing we're going to look at is the common application. This is by far the most broad-based universal application, right, that you use for the vast majority of your non-UC schools, right? So which means for your private schools, for many out-of-state public universities, for those of you in California, this is the main application system that you will be using and that you'll be filling out, okay? All right, some things to note. There are going to be some differences this year compared to some previous years. So one of the things that Common App has been advertising here is that they now have new options for the sex and gender category to allow students a little bit more latitude to explain their gender identity, right? So keep in mind that this is still optional. You do not have to actually kind of fill this out even if you don't want to, right? Same thing goes with like things like the demographics, your ethnic background. That's also still an optional thing. It has been for many, many years. Okay. They've also talked about streamlining the process for eligibility for the Common App fee waiver. I guess that means just fewer questions, right? Haven't really gone through that much detail on it, but it's obviously a good change for those students who are eligible for that, right? So normally what I tell students is that the litmus test is if you were normally eligible for free lunch based on your family income, that would probably qualify you for a Common App fee waiver as well. Now, I know for some schools, they just offered free lunch to everybody because of COVID, but you have to check, maybe talk to your school counselor and find out what the cutoff is for like, the family income for you to be eligible for one of those waivers. I mean, if you are eligible, that's great because that means you can submit applications for free in some cases, right? But if it's not eligible, I mean, obviously, like that means your family should be able to afford these applications. Okay, so next is that certain colleges have also changed their options now. One notable change is that USC now has an early action, right? So this normally means the deadline is going to be November 1st, like a lot of EA schools, but they don't announce until January, right? So it's not something where you can apply to USC and then hopefully find out and then not apply to some safety schools, right? So, which is great because then a lot of students do want to apply to USC, and applying earlier might help make you stand out more, right? Show that you're actually more interested in USC as a result because you're applying that much earlier. Okay. And I've also seen in some cases when schools first add an EA option, the acceptance rates tend to be higher than a lot of their peer institutions. So if USC is very high on your list, you should definitely consider applying EA and take advantage of this new policy. Okay. One other notable change is that Caltech has changed their regular EA to make it now a restricted early action, which is kind of, I think, a very strategic choice on their part, because most of the time people would apply to both MIT and Caltech, right? And if they got an MIT, maybe they prefer that over Caltech. So I think this is something that they're doing to show if you're really, really interested in Caltech, you wouldn't just apply to them as like another throw-in EA. That if you did apply EA, it's because you're actually much more serious and you're much more interested in Caltech, right? Which I guess if Caltech is really your top school, that would definitely make you have a better chance relative to in the past, their acceptance rates. Although Caltech had been previously on record, like MIT, as saying that EA doesn't really give you an advantage over, let's say, regular decision. I think this changes things though, because if they add an REA, they're restricting a lot more people from applying to it. So, which theoretically should mean that the acceptance rate for this should be higher. Okay, but we'll have to wait until next year to find out whether or not that holds true. Okay, so one other main thing is that there are more schools now joining the Common App, right? Which is a blessing and a curse. The way I see it is that, yes, it makes your life as a senior easier because then you have fewer separate applications to fill out. But here's the weird thing. Having everything in the Common App also incentivizes other people to simply apply to more colleges, because if it saves you some time, it's easier. That also means that there are certain colleges that are like, I could use the same essay. I've already finished filling out the application. Why not apply to more schools, right? So the problem there is that that also has, over the last years, like maybe the last decade or so, there's been a steady rise in terms of the number of applications that people are filing. Not only are there more people applying, but each of those individual students are applying to a record number of applications, right? Or a record number of colleges. So this whole thing has made this like massive arms race of people like just applying to as many colleges as possible. And I think part of that too is a bit of the panic or the anxiety about like seeing these acceptance rates get lower. The lower these acceptance rates go, the more people feel like they need to apply to more schools. But unfortunately, that's like this weird chicken and egg effect where people do that as the reaction to it, but that actually even causes the acceptance rates to go down even more. So it's this vicious cycle of people wanting to apply to more schools, but that also decreasing the acceptance rates, which then makes people want to apply to more schools. So unfortunately, that's the world we live in for college admissions. That's just the reality that we're faced with. Okay. So these are some of the most notable new schools that are now using the Common App that had not been in the past. Many of these schools were exclusively using something called the coalition application, which, if you're not familiar, was designed as a rival or an alternative to the Common Application. But now that many of these schools have joined the bandwagon for Common App, it's made the coalition app honestly a little bit obsolete, right? Because, you know, one of the ideas of having coalition exclusive schools is that it sort of like made students want to apply using the coalition app. But I think the problem is that there were so many high school guidance counselors who were just basically complaining, why do we even have this other alternate application system? It just creates more work for everybody, right? And so these colleges responded by saying, you know what, next year we're just going to join the Common App. You know, we understand that it's going to make things easier. We're going to want to make more people apply to us. That's also maybe the self-serving component. Some of these schools are deciding, hey, why don't we just join Common App? We might actually get even more applicants, right? So these are some of the more notable ones, like UT Austin has been in the past like even harder to apply to because they have this separate system called Apply Texas, right? So 3 of the most notable Texas schools are now joining the Common Application, which actually makes things a lot easier for students to apply to their private schools. And if they wanted to apply to out-of-state Texas universities, they can now do so more easily. University of Washington, like we mentioned earlier, definitely a very, very long time holdout from the Common App. They, for many years, just refused to join Common App, but now they sort of just caved in, which will also make it actually maybe much more popular now. I mean, they have an incredible computer science program, which is typically ranked in the top 5 or 6 for undergrad CS. And so with that extra roadblock out of the way, I anticipate that University of Washington is going to get even way more applications next year than they had in previous years. Same goes with the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. UIUC is also very popular among students who are going for CS and engineering. So that's probably going to make them even more competitive based on the fact that it reduces one more separate hurdle, for students to apply to them, because they don't have to use this alternate application system. They can just do so in the context of their, Common App. Okay. All right. So we also want to talk about certain strategies that you can use, some things to be mindful of when you're using the Common Application to fill out your applications. So first, let's talk about the importance of the personal statement. This is your main Common App essay. Okay. So for this main Common App essay, some things to keep in mind. First is that with the relative decline of standardized testing, SAT, ACT, because with all these schools now going test optional, Certain subjective factors like the essays and recommendation letters have taken on an increasing importance, which means this is going to be the way that you're going to want to distinguish yourself from other people if they don't have an SAT or ACT score in order to compare you versus some other students. So oftentimes a really good essay can serve as your face to college admissions officers, since to be honest, they rarely, if ever, get a chance to meet you in person. All the information that they're using to base their judgment on whether or not you deserve to get in is like secondhand information, recommendation letters. If you do an interview, the person who's interviewing is probably going to be an alumnus or an alumna. So the admissions people are just basically indirectly getting what they say about you. Your essays really are this main chance that you can sort of shape the narrative, literally, right? In terms of how they see you. So I think it's a really important tool. This is most likely the essay that you're going to be spending the most time on because it's really your best foot forward. It's a chance for you to craft the picture of what you want them to see about you. Okay. Now, next is college admissions is also a very human process. This is why the essay is so important, right? So you want to like, I guess, disabuse of yourself of this idea that college admissions is like, there's an algorithm that determines who deserves to get in. No, that's far from the truth, right? So it's a very human process in the sense that, admissions people will read your essay. If the admissions officer really loves it and feels like you've made a connection with them, they feel like they really got to know you from their essay, from your essay, they will root for you. They will advocate for you in the committee meetings, and they will push for you if they really feel like you have something unique to offer in the incoming class. So I think that's really where a good essay will help set you apart. Okay. So ultimately your essay can help distinguish you from the growing number of applicants who may have some fairly similar credentials, but a unique and interesting and compelling essay can really be that difference maker that will make them pick you over your competition. Okay. So some other things to keep in mind. So these are the common application prompts. There's about 7 of them. But to be honest, it's probably not all that important that you pick the right prompt, right? Because 2 of the prompts here are so broad that you can write about just about anything. So the first one, when it asks you about like some students have a background, identity, interest, or talent that is so meaningful they believe their application would be incomplete without it. If this sounds like you, please share your story. I mean, what is your personal statement but your story? Do you know what I mean? Like any topic that you write about can be made to fit prompt 1. So in essence, it was already an open-ended prompt to begin with. Now, to add on top of that, you also have prompt 7, which is share an essay of any topic of your choice. It can be one you've already written, one that responds to a different prompt, or one of your own design. So if you want to just customize a prompt that you want to write on, you totally can, right? So there's really a lot of different ways you can do this. So normally what I advise you to do is it's probably better not to necessarily, like prematurely narrow down the list of topics you can write about by just simply picking one of these topics and going for it. I often advocate that you write the essay first and then you pick the prompt that best fits it. Okay, that way you feel less constrained. You have a lot more options to think about when you're considering what you want to write about. Okay. So some bits of advice in terms of when you're writing your personal statement. First, think strategically. What I mean by this is a good essay highlights certain qualities and virtues that colleges are looking for, right? So don't just think, oh, I can tell this good story about me. Okay, if the good story doesn't really have much of a point, or there's not really much they can see about you, then it doesn't really add value to your application. A good essay will give admissions people a window into personal traits, qualities that they feel like, they really admire, or that they feel can be an asset in terms of the incoming freshman class they're trying to assemble. Okay, so if let's say, for example, your main hallmarks are you're just naturally very inquisitive, you're curious about a lot of things, and once you get hooked, you're very passionate about it. You really go, you dive headlong into the pursuit of it. You want to try to figure out as much as you can about that intellectual topic. If that's you, try to find a topic that highlights that strength. Okay. Or if you're more of a people person, right? So, you're very compassionate, you're really very concerned about other people, and you've done a lot of things that really highlight that, then sure, pick a narrative, pick an anecdote that you think exemplifies that particular quality or trait. Okay. So it's also a related thing to this is you want to try to accentuate your strengths, right? So a good essay will be able to identify what it is about you that you think is really exceptional. If you're grappling with this, if this is something that you're having a hard time identifying, I mean, it might not be a bad idea to talk to family and friends, right? So of course your parents have known you your whole life, literally, right? And of course your friends, if you've interacted with them, they probably can give you some very valuable insights into certain qualities that make you their friend, right? So ideally, if you have like very close friends, they can share some things about like why they think you're a good friend. Okay. And that might give you some windows into like certain qualities that you think you can actually write about. Okay. I think it's also smart for you to plan concurrently with your supplemental essays, right? Some students will feel like, oh, I just want to write the personal statement only, right? But especially if you're applying to some early action or early decision schools, you want to make sure that when you write your personal statement, that it won't potentially overlap with or repeat any of the information that you're going to share in your supplemental essays. I would say one of the biggest pitfalls is writing your personal statement that's exclusively focused on your interest in your major. Because what do you do when all of a sudden, like half the schools that you're applying to will ask you to write an essay about why you chose a certain major, right? That runs the risk of not only being redundant, it also will be potentially, something that paints you as being one-dimensional, especially if the personal statement and that why major essay are the only two essays that they read about you. Okay. So especially if you do have a lot more things to bring to the table, I would really maybe examine that first and then plan how you want to divide the different things that you want to talk about yourself in the various essays that you're going to be writing. Okay. And then lastly, this is, by now it might seem like cliche advice, but it's very, very relevant still. Be yourself, right? So I think sometimes we get carried away in terms of trying to play this cat and mouse game of trying to outguess what the admissions office might want, or you want to paint yourself as truly exceptional and unique, but then you talk about things and it doesn't even sound like you, right? If you had like a family member or a friend read it, they're like, who is this person, right? That's not a good thing, right? Because, it's not like you have to share exactly the same elements about yourself, but if your recommendation letter writers write about you and they talk about completely different things, and it's basically something that is inconsistent with the you that you're trying to portray in the essay, that could actually be really detrimental to your application, right? So that's definitely something you have to think about, right? So what are some things that people know about you? What are some things that are pretty clearly defined strengths that you bring? I think those are things that you think, you need to plan in advance. That way you can pick topics that really highlight this consistent theme of who you are as a person. Okay. All right. So the next other major portion that I want to give you some advice on is the activities section of the Common Application, right? There are a lot of things that you can fit in there, but you are limited in terms of the number of things you can put in. There are really only about 10 slots that you can put in the activities section. So be strategic, be decisive about which activities you really want to highlight and in which order. Right. So one of the good things about the Common App, though, is that they have these little up and down arrows, which I guess I kind of like slightly cut off here with the image that I put, but you can slot them up or down after you fill them out. Okay. So that way, if you want to maybe prioritize one or two activities that are a little bit more relevant to your major, things that highlight more your preparation, sure, I would bump those up a little bit. I would rank them higher in terms of your ordering of the different activities. If you have exceptional leadership, like you're president or vice president of a couple of clubs, I would probably bump those upward as well. If you have like long-term commitments to your various extracurriculars, like you've been in a club for all 4 years and you've dedicated a lot of time and energy, normally that probably goes hand in hand with leadership, but in some cases, no, that'd still be good for you to highlight the fact that you've been very, very involved in those pursuits, right? Your description should also be used to highlight your achievements relative to other students who do the same activity. What I mean by this is that it's not going to be very helpful for your description if you said like, I have been a JV and varsity basketball player for 4 years. If that's all you're saying, then I mean, I guess that's good that you're varsity, but they don't really find out much else about you. Okay. But if you say something like shorter and more condensed, almost like resume form, you don't even have to write in full sentences. You can simply say things like 3-year varsity player, voted, most improved player, team captain, 12th grade. Do you know what I mean? Like things like that actually show the admissions office how accomplished you are within that realm, within that activity compared to other students who are pursuing the same activity, right? So it's really important for you to use this to really set yourself apart as best you can. Okay. Now, the Common App only allows you about 150 characters to describe your activity, right? So I would normally suggest if it's one of your main top activities, you can also use the space after your Common App is pasted in, or the Common App essay is pasted in. There's a section called additional information where you're given another 650 word text box where you can use it as kind of like an expanded resume. You can use it to show links to various online content that you want to share with admissions people, right? It's really a fairly flexible space where you can articulate other things about you. You can even expand upon the descriptions that you previously wrote in the activity descriptions, or add more activities if you have more than 10. Okay, but I wouldn't just flood that with every single conceivable thing, even things that are just really minor, because there can also be information overload. That's basically one potential pitfall, right? If all I read is a wall of text and you're not very good at labeling and clearly showing which ones are also important, they might just not focus on it that much. Okay, so there is an art form to using that additional information section to really highlight and draw attention to your core activities. Okay, and then lastly, I also want to give the advice of give yourself the benefit of the doubt when it comes to listing how many hours you spend each week on your given activities. Because some students, they'll only say, I only have 1 hour meetings every single, like once a week. So they put 1 hour a week and that's it. But maybe you're an officer in that club. Maybe you spend maybe an extra 2 or 3 hours preparing things for those meetings. So I would definitely count those, right? You don't have to count just the official times that you're actually in the club itself, especially if you do a lot of things outside that club, right? So of course, on the other side, don't go overboard with that either, right? Don't overly embellish your hours because you think, ooh, it's going to look better if I say 10 hours instead of 4, right? If you can't really back it up, that could be problematic, right? I've known of some cases where some colleges have contacted the counselor just to see whether or not, the activities sound about right to them, right? So colleges have been known to do some of these spot checks to see whether or not the information that you're telling them is accurate. Okay, but more than likely, they'll also see whether or not it's realistic, because you're like, if you're putting way too many hours there and it just doesn't look right, that could be a potential red flag. I've heard of admissions people who told me before is like, yeah, I started adding up the hours and that's literally more hours than there are in a given week, right? That's physically impossible, right? So obviously that would be problematic for admissions people if they see that, because then that would be, that can clearly tell that you're not being very honest with them, okay? All right. Recommendation letters are also an important part of the process. So one of the things I tell students is if you haven't already done so, you have to have a game plan for who you're going to ask for recommendation letters. Okay. So recommendation letters are really important because admissions officers can then find out more about you based on your interactions with mentors in your life. Okay. They're actually in a good place to evaluate things because then they can actually tell the college what you might be like in their classroom environments, right? So that the professors might have that sense in terms of how you would add to the classroom environment, because you're going to college to be in yet another classroom environment, right? So this is vitally important for them to be able to see how you would contribute to these kinds of settings. So it's usually best, I would say, to prioritize your 11th grade teachers, especially those teachers that you've had from AP classes, if they know and like you really well. Okay. Now, if that's a little bit of a problem, you didn't really interact well with your 11th grade teachers as much, you can maybe, as a backup plan, use a 10th grade teacher, maybe a 12th grade teacher if maybe you've had them in a previous year. But generally 12th grade is not the best idea, because by the time they need to send in these rec letters, they've maybe only known you for like a month or two. So I don't know if they can really write very expansive, and detailed recommendation letters on your behalf, right? If possible, I normally advise students to go ahead and have a balance and have one STEM and one non-STEM teacher, just to kind of like show that you're very well-rounded. Because when you go to colleges, for instance, even if you're a math major, you can't get away with only taking math classes. You still have to be able to write an essay to pass certain general education classes. So it helps to show that you have a more balanced side and you can also excel in other classes outside of your major. Okay. And then lastly, on this category, many schools will actually allow you to submit one or sometimes more what they call other recommenders. Normally, a good person to pick from this is someone who had been a mentor in some different capacity, like maybe you've done research, or maybe you've been heavily involved in community service and there's someone who knows you from that context, right? So ideally, you want someone who can give them a different window and a different, like, I guess, context in terms of your other strengths, right? So let's say like they've already have a couple of good teacher recommendation letters, but something can show more like your interpersonal or interactions with people outside of school. I think that would be great. Or maybe your potential for research. Those are all possible, viable, good things that you can have in a good other recommender. Okay. All right, so we're going to shift gears now and we're going to take a look at UC admissions, right? So the UC application. So one of the good things, the timing is really good for this seminar because we now also just got recently some information from the UCs. They've released their fall 2022 data. So we can actually dive into it today and take a look at what's going on with these UCs, right? So first of all, some things to keep in mind here. So for many of you here who live in California, if you're in California, right, the UC system represents a tremendous value because you're getting, in many cases, a similar education to what you would get from like a top Ivy level school, like Berkeley and UCLA, especially, I would say, in many cases for many of those majors are on par or very close to the type of education you receive in a lot of top universities at a fraction of the cost in terms of the tuition, right? So I think it really is very important for you to go ahead and make sure that you're also putting in a lot of effort in terms of like having a good UC application. So one key thing to remember is that the UC colleges are still test blind. They do not look at your SAT or ACT score, even if you submit it. They simply won't evaluate it as part of the application process. Now, some of you might say, oh, but I saw there was a way for you to put it down on the application. What that does is basically you could use your SAT or ACT scores for eligibility purposes if you do not have the requisite 3.0 weighted UC GPA in order to qualify or be eligible for UC consideration. That's really the only reason why it's there. Other than that, if you were otherwise normally eligible, they simply won't look at it. Okay. Now, an important thing to remember is that each UC campus, it seems like for the last 3, 4, 5 years, have been receiving what they call record numbers in terms of the number of applications. Case in point, UCLA is the single most popular college in the world if you were to measure it based on the number of people applying, right? So there were just a shade under 150,000 people applying, and that's just freshman applications. That's not even counting transfer applications, right? So as you can tell, UCLA has gotten more and more competitive, and the numbers are going to shock you when I show you the actual admissions numbers from this year, okay? So some UC campuses are also increasing their admissions of non-California students, but I've also been hearing there's going to be a trend swinging to the opposite of that. They're trying their best to make room for more California students because that's like sort of the mission of the UC system anyway, right? So we're going to parse these numbers. We're going to take a look at them and really see what's going on right now. Okay, so first we're going to take a look at UCLA and Berkeley, right? So UCLA, haha, oh my God, this is really scary. They're now down to 8.56%. Okay, so as a reference, last year they were about 12%, 11 or 12%, if I recall, right? So it's gone down quite a lot. Berkeley too. Berkeley was at 14% last year. I was predicting about 12. I was a little bit off. USC was something I was way off on because I was predicting about 10%. So that's even smaller than that. Okay. All right, so UCLA is now the single hardest public university to get into in the US, right? So it's even harder than Michigan, obviously Berkeley. And as you can see here, the UCs, especially these top UCs, are trying to prioritize California students. They do have a higher acceptance rate for California students versus, let's say, for example, out-of-state residents and international students. International is pretty low for both Berkeley and UCLA in comparison to the overall rates. So which means if you are an international applicant, you have to be really exceptional to be able to get one of these spots because it is much, much more difficult to get in. Okay. All right. Next, let's take a look. So these are the mid-tier UCs. So for many students, these four, they're going to have very similar GPA numbers. And you can see here, most of them have fairly similar acceptance rates. But one kind of, different thing from these, from what we saw from Berkeley and UCLA, is that the out-of-state application acceptance rate is higher for these schools for some reason. Okay, and this is what I was saying. Like some of these mid-tier UCs were actually being a lot more generous because presumably they were looking for more out-of-state students because in a way, I guess maybe this is the cynic in me, but my theory at least is they were trying to get more out-of-state tuition because they could charge more for an out-of-state or international student that they could for an in-state student. Okay, so hopefully, though, based on what I've been reading in the news, there's going to be at least a little bit more of a concerted effort to try to bring that up a little bit more so that the in-state numbers are going to go up a little bit and they're going to try to reduce the number of out-of-state applicants that they're accepting. Okay, but as you can see here, yeah, I mean, there was a time when schools like Irvine, San Diego, Santa Barbara were hovering around like 40 or 50% acceptance rate. Now they're all about 20 something percent. So all of them are getting much, much more competitive. Davis has maybe stayed a little bit closer to what they've been in the last couple of years or so. So Davis is still at about like 37%. 2 or 3 years back is probably about 45%. So they haven't dipped that much. Okay. And the way I read this is it's largely based on certain metropolitan areas being a little bit more popular, right? Davis, which is a little closer to Sacramento, it's not as popular an area. Whereas Irvine, it's in Orange County. It's definitely a little more popular. San Diego is nice and sunny. So Santa Barbara. So you're getting more people wanting to apply to those campuses. Okay. It'll also partially explain why UCLA is much more popular than Berkeley, right? Because even though Berkeley historically has had stronger, departments for, fields like engineering, computer science, and business, I guess there's just a lot more allure of applying to sunny Southern California. Okay, now to round out the rest of the UCs, even Santa Cruz is now down to under 50%. That's actually really startling to me because I feel like just about 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, Santa Cruz was accepting like 70 or 80% of their incoming classes or their applicant pool, right? Even Riverside, which used to be like the backup UC, right? That was oftentimes the reputation of Riverside. That's obviously now been supplanted by Merced. Riverside is now accepting 68%. If you had told that to someone like 5 or 10 years ago, they would be shocked, right? Because Riverside accepted almost everybody. It was like 90, 95% at one point. Okay. All right. So that's the landscape we're dealing with, right? It's getting much, much more competitive these days. So now let's take a look at the UC application. What can you do then? What's within your control in the UC application that will help enhance your chances of getting in? So, well, first, let's go through some major updates in terms of some changes to the UC systems, right, or the UC application. This is the first year that Berkeley will now allow students to pick an alternate major. In previous years, Berkeley was the outlier in the sense that all the other 8 UC campuses allowed you to pick a main choice major and then an alt or a backup major. Berkeley just allowed you one choice. Right. So it's a little curious to see why they're now bringing this now. Right. So they're now allowing a backup major. So it remains to be seen, though, like whether or not they will, give you serious consideration for that, just because like Berkeley's so much more competitive these days. Because UCLA has sort of been on record as saying they almost never really consider students for the alt major. Right. If they do, it's got to be in the same college or school as whichever one you picked your main major in. So realistically speaking, even if they're not allowing this, I'm honestly just a little bit more skeptical of whether or not they would genuinely consider you for the backup major. Okay, so I would recommend maybe looking to see if maybe the backup major can be something like pick something that maybe they really don't have a lot of students in that might give you a shot, right? Another fairly minor change, I guess, is that they tweak the wording of prompt 8 in the UC personal insight questions, which we will take a look at a little bit later as well. But last year they said, beyond, this is for prompt 8, beyond what was already been shared in your application, what do you believe makes you stand out as a strong candidate for admission to the University of California? Now they simply left out those 3 words. So it's what do you believe makes you a strong candidate? I mean, it's a minor wording difference, but I think this whole stand out as a strong candidate sort of like scared off some students from picking this topic. So they're feeling like, hey, if we remove that slight qualification there, hey, I'm a strong candidate. But maybe some students feel like they're a little scared of saying, I stand out as a strong candidate. Okay. So if that was maybe something that dissuaded you, that might be good for you. Okay. I would say maybe perhaps the biggest change this year is that they're now moving ahead the filing period for the UC applications to October 1st. In previous years, it was the whole month of November. You would be able to send in your application as early as November 1st, but the UC application window closes in November 30th. This year, it starts as early as October 1st, but ends November 30th. So instead of 1 month to send in your UC application, you now have 2 months, right? Which is, I guess, a good change. It gives you a little bit more of an early shot to send in your application. I would probably recommend that you send it sometime in October anyway, right? Just because there's more of a chance that they'll read your file when they're less busy, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But one more change that your parents might be interested in is they also announced something called a tuition stability plan. So in the past, tuition normally in most colleges increases year by year because they adjust it for inflation, right? So what they're doing here is that they're not necessarily making it cheaper, or they're not promising not to raise the tuition. What they will do is they make adjustments based on how much they normally increase tuition. And so the first year will be slightly more expensive than it had been, but it's meant to sort of equalize things just so there's a little bit of predictability. And who knows, for some people that might be good for financial planning. So there's a little bit more of a sense in terms of what to expect. Okay. All right. So here's the UC timeline, right? So normally I say like August 1st, again, also like Common App is when the UC application goes live. So now you can actually start opening up and filling out the UC application. October 1st is, like I said earlier, the beginning of the filing period. November 30th is the end of it. And normally, while most UC campuses will announce sometime in late March to early or mid-April, students who are eligible or being considered for something called a Regent Scholarship can hear as early as late January to maybe sometime in February. Okay, so what this is that it's somewhat of a hybrid scholarship. It's partially a merit scholarship in that they're giving it based on your academic credentials and or your extracurriculars, but it also has a need-based financial aid component to it, right? So for some students, they will get a token amount if, let's say, for example, they're not eligible for financial aid. But if you are eligible for financial aid, this can give you a bigger, like almost like a bigger grant, if you will, right? So if you really are eligible for a lot of financial aid, the Regent Scholarship can be quite large, like it'd be several $1,000s, right, each year. Okay, but I guess for everybody, one key benefit is that being a Regent Scholar gives you access to early registration. And if you know how big the UCs are and how many students there are and how oftentimes you hear sort of like gripes from students about like, oh, I tried to get into this class, but it filled up really quickly, like within a couple of hours, right? Having this early access to registration is a huge, huge boon for many students, okay? And of course, May 1st for all the UCs is the deadline for you to file something called your statement of intent to register. This is basically the deadline to commit to the school that you've been accepted to, okay? All right, so the key recommendations I want to give you for the UC application is this. Much like the UC, the Common App, plan your essays in advance. Try to figure out which ones you're going to write on because you have 8 topics and you can only write on 4. Don't just take the easy way out and write the 4 that are the easiest for you to write about. Don't unduly use 3 out of the 4 essays to talk about your main activity because you're most comfortable writing about it, right? So you really want to strategically use your 4 prompts to really highlight the 4 biggest strengths that you want to talk about. I would often say that at least one of those 4 topics should talk about your prospective major, right? Because it's going to be pretty important for you to show evidence that you're actually prepared for whatever you're going to pursue, especially if you're going to go for a competitive field like business, pre-med, engineering, or computer science. Okay. Next is it's also important for you to know the UC expectation when it comes to these essays. There is a reason why these are a little bit shorter at 350 words as opposed to the longer 650 of the Common Application, right? So they want you to answer these almost like they were interview questions. They want you to write about it in a more straightforward fashion. They don't really like it if you're being overly creative and fluffy and ornate with your writing style, right? So don't spend half the essay setting the scene, so to speak, with creative writing elements and a lot of extra dialogue, because in a way that is sort of impeding their ability to see whether or not you're actually talking about substantive things like what have you done to prepare for your major, or why are you interested in this particular field, or what have you done to help better your community in some way, right? So really just focus on it as if you were just directly talking to a UC person in front of you. Right? How would you articulate it to show them exactly what you've managed to accomplish in your 4 years? Okay. Next, organize your activities. I think this is really important for the UC application because unlike the Common App where we talked about you have up or down arrows where you can slot down certain activities in order to prioritize your most important ones, for the UCs, the order in which you enter them is the order that they see them. So it's probably important for you to do some pre-planning so that you know ahead of time which ones you're going to want to enter so that they see the most impressive activities first. I think that's very important psychologically so that they sort of focus in on your biggest accomplishments first. Okay, and then lastly, submit your applications early. We've had HS2 employees before who've worked as UC admissions readers who have just told us that yes, they start receiving applications even as early as mid-November, right? And that was when it was still November 1st to November 30th. So it stands to reason that if you open the filing period up to October, they may even start getting these applications to read by mid to late October, maybe by early November. So try to submit your application sometime in October if possible, okay? Next is, I just want to give you a little bit of a tour of the UC Personal Insight questions. So there is really a lot of variation here. So if you're a big leader, for instance, you have a lot of officer positions, prompt 1 would be a good fit. If you're more the creative type, right, artistically, or you're just a very innovative problem solver, prompt 2 would actually be a really, really good fit. If you have an unusually exceptional talent or ability, I think prompt 3 is really a good thing to write about. I've often seen some students get supplemental or follow-up essays from the UCs if you decide to write about a greatest talent or skill, because then they allow you to elaborate more on that talent or skill if it is something that interests them, right? If it's something valuable, like you're an extremely talented musician or artist, or you've been exceptionally good at like a sport or maybe an activity like debate, you definitely should put a little bit more a spotlight on it using prompt 3. Prompt 4 is really great for things like internships, right? So where you've been exposed to a lot more advanced knowledge or information about a given field. Prompt 4 is an ideal place for you to write about it and maybe talk about how that made you more interested in your major. Okay. So prompt 5 is definitely a very good option for students to write about if they've faced a significant challenge, right? I would say maybe refrain from talking about like maybe COVID related stuff if it's not really all that different from what other people experienced. If you're writing about like, oh, I wasn't able to do clubs in person, I was stuck at home, I don't know if that would be really a significant challenge, right? But I mean, far be it for me to kind of like lump everybody in the same boat. There are going to be some people though who faced even more significant challenges during their pandemic, or may not even be pandemic related, right? They have other issues that they had to overcome in order to reach where they are now. So if this seems like something that you would want to write about, I would say, definitely figure out, first of all, if it feels like this was a major thing. And as long as you can show, your ability to overcome adversity, if you show like innovative ways to solve these problems, I think it could be a good topic for you. Okay. Prompt 6 is usually a good opportunity for you to talk about your interest in your major. So you can either write about your interest in your major with prompt 4 if it's more centered around a specific activity, or if you just want to talk about multiple things that have gotten you interested in a certain field, I think prompt 6 would work just as well. Obviously, we've already talked about prompt 8, but prompt 7 is a good place for you to talk about, especially if you've done a lot of community service or volunteering. Okay, some other things to think about. There are still some other application systems out there. I would say the 2 most notable holdouts are MIT, which still to this day stubbornly insist on having their own application system, even if that application system is so dated. It's a little bit of a frustration for me and other counselors, but they still have that. Georgetown still has their own as well. So these are the 2 outliers of major, like, top 20, top 25 schools that still have their own application system. The vast majority of colleges no longer have an exclusive use of Coalition app. So any Coalition school will probably be included as as a subset within the Common Application, right? So more schools will use Common App. So there's very little reason these days to use the Coalition app, right? Rutgers is the only school I know that actually still requires the Coalition app, but not use the Common App. Okay. And then lastly, I want to talk about some ways that HS2 Academy can help you stand out. So first of all, we're really proud of our track record of success. Every single year, we help hundreds of students apply to top colleges, and we really stand by our results. Every single year, we've had students getting into all the top colleges. But to be honest, we're also just as proud of students who are getting into like maybe a mid-tier UC, if that was even for them a very difficult school to get into, right? So success, of course, is relative. So we take as much pride in all our students in terms of helping them maximize their results and really trying to get them into the most competitive colleges that they can get into. Okay, so next I also want to talk about